Julie Mae Bowling was born on November 21, 1961 to parents Harold and Dorothy. In 2006, 45-year-old Julie was married to Mark Bowling, who was 9 years younger than she was and lived in Rocky Mount, North Carolina. However, their relationship was far from perfect and Mark wasn't exactly the most faithful person. He was a mortician and owned the Bowling Funeral Home in Crematory, which had 3 locations. His parents were also morticians and were the reason for his current success. Before meeting Julie in the late 1990s, Mark was involved with a local grocery store cashier named Rose Vincent, who was only 19 years old. They met after he arranged her stepmother's funeral. Rose was devastated because her stepmother had basically raised her and she found comfort in Mark. She would later say that Mark was the first man she had ever been with. They continued the relationship for about 5 months and only stopped because he met and married Julie. However, the relationship started up again around 2003 or 2004. At that point, they were meeting on a regular basis at the funeral homes he owned. Rose was also married now and had 3 young children. This time around, she fell in love with Mark and wanted to be Mrs. Bowling. Not to mention, Mark was a very well-off individual, and he had made a lot of money from his funeral homes. This was a different lifestyle for Rose, who grew up very impoverished. In the end, it would prove to be a recipe for disaster. In early December, Mark left for a scuba trip in Florida while Julie stayed home. On December 8th, Julie strangely failed to show up for work and she wasn't answering her phone. Her friend and co-worker, Linda Gardner, was worried because Julie had been telling her for the past few weeks that she feared Mark was going to kill her and that he could get away with it by putting her in the funeral home's cremation oven. She also told her another time that she felt that he was having her followed. When Linda arrived at the house that day, all her fears would come true. When she pulled up, she found the garage door open and Linda's vehicle still inside. Upon entering, she sadly found Julie lying on her back, shot to death, and quickly called 911. When investigators arrived, they found that she had been shot 4 times. Upon searching the home, they found a gun safe with a lot of .32 caliber Smith & Wesson bullets sitting on the top of it. Those were checked and matched to the bullets used to kill Julie. However, they still needed to find the murder weapon. The following day, when investigators brought Mark in for questioning, they asked if he knew who might have committed the crime. That's when he came clean and confessed to stepping outside the marriage on multiple occasions and said he had also used escort services a few times. He then gave them the name of his most recent affair, Rose Vincent. He claims that she even began stalking him and had said that she wanted to wring Julie's neck and take a baseball bat to her. When Rose was brought in, she initially denied being involved. But once investigators falsely told her that they had proof and that Mark had identified her as the killer, she suddenly had a change of heart and began telling everything. While she confessed to pulling the trigger, she said Mark was the mastermind behind the whole thing. She said that Mark had offered her $50,000 to kill his wife and even threatened to kill himself if she didn't do it. He also promised to give her everything she wanted if she got rid of Julie. She said he even provided her with a map and specific instructions on how to carry out the crime while he was away in Florida. Investigators also learned that they had tried to carry out the murder on 3 different occasions before finally being successful on December 8, 2006. She said that on the day of the murder, she arrived early in the morning when it was still dark. Before Mark left for his trip, he had unscrewed the outside bulb so that the light wouldn't come on. After arriving, she sent Mark a text. Mark responded saying, "Let me call Julie and find out when she is leaving." Interestingly, the answering machine picked up right before Julie and recorded their conversation. When he asked her what time she is heading to work, she tells him she is leaving at her normal time and then gives him the time. He then asked if she is going out through the garage, which she says, of course. He tells her he loves her and hangs up. It's a very strange conversation, and I have to imagine Julie felt the same way. Mark texts Rose back, letting her know that Julie is coming out of the garage and to get ready. When Julie opens the garage, she turns to set the alarm, and that's when Rose rushes her. Julie turns around only to be shot multiple times. Rose said that she kept shooting until the gun was empty. She then drove to her stepmother's cemetery and buried the gun next to her grave. Before the interrogation was over, She told them the location of the cemetery, which was on Old Carriage Road, not far from the home. Sure enough, upon searching the cemetery, they found a Depression-era .32 caliber Harrington and Richardson revolver. She said the whole plan for the murder started when she jokingly said she should knock off Julie. However, Mark took that as an opportunity to get rid of his wife and begin planning the murder. At that point, investigators had all they needed and arrested them both. In the end, Rose pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder and was sentenced to 28 to 34 years in prison. She also agreed to testify against Mark. However, 6 days into his trial in October 2008, he also decided to take a plea deal and pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and conspiracy to murder and was sentenced to 19 years and 8 months in prison. While his projected release was August 31, 2022, he wouldn't make it and died of natural causes in 2018 at the age of 47. As of July 2024, Rose is still serving her time in the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women. She is projected to be released on May 26, 2035, and will likely not be released early for good behavior because while in prison, she has received 13 infractions involving self-injury, theft of property, assault on an inmate by throwing liquids, selling or misusing medication, and interfering with staff. On May 12, 1972, a fisherman stumbled upon a man's remains in a field near a canal in Eloise, Florida. Unfortunately, the victim had no identification on him and was badly decomposed. An autopsy determined that the cause of death was 2 gunshot wounds to the head and the manner of death was homicide. The man's age was estimated to be between 40 and 50 years old. However, with no way to identify him, he was buried as a John Doe in the Lakeside Memorial Cemetery in Winter Haven, Florida. The case would then go unsolved for the next 52 years. 2 years after the man's remains were found, in January 1974, a prisoner named Charles Williams contacted investigators claiming to have information about the murder. He said that in 1973, he was in Rayford Prison with a man by the name of Clarence Ingram, who was in prison for killing Sam Holland in Lake County in 1973. Ingram told Williams about an incident that occurred at a bar in Winter Haven, Florida in 1972. He said that he and a man named Edgar Todd met an unknown man at the bar and they all 3 left together in his vehicle. However, during the drive an argument broke out and the man was shot twice with a .22 caliber pistol. After he was dead, they dumped his body near a canal and stole his tools valued between $1,000 and $1,500. The tools were ultimately sold to Ingram's brother Johnny. They then drove the man's car to Michigan and sold it for $500. They were able to confirm that Ingram had been in Michigan because police had stopped him in Paw Paw, Michigan on May 25, 1972. However, it still didn't get them any closer to finding out the man's identity. In February of 2017, the case was re-looked at and the man's remains were exhumed. His DNA was then sent to the University of North Texas and subsequently entered into Cody's, but no matches were found. In November 2023, they sought the help of Othram, along with their forensic genetic genealogy team, and they were able to provide a potential lead, a man by the name of Mac Lavelle Proctor. Mac was born on November 28, 1914, and was last seen by his family in Georgia sometime between 1969 and 1972. However, he was never officially reported missing. His family described him as a master mechanic, hence the tools in his car. A second DNA test was then performed and confirmed the remains belonged to Matt. Unfortunately, his murderers cannot be brought to justice because Clarence Ingram died in 1995. Edgar Todd died in 2015 and Johnny Ingram, who bought the tools, died in 2003. Investigators said there is now enough circumstantial evidence to arrest them if they were still alive. Thankfully, at least his family now has some long-awaited answers. Maria Frances Loderbach was born with fetal alcohol syndrome on November 17, 1987, and adopted by Victor and Mary Loderbach. An agency handled the adoption and they never met Maria's biological parents. She grew up in Vandalia, Ohio, and attended Butler High School, where she unfortunately stayed in constant trouble. She had a very disrespectful attitude and was always getting into arguments. However, no matter what she did, her loving parents always stuck by her side. After high school, her parents encouraged her to join the Marines, thinking it might provide her with the help she needed. However, they never imagined how big of a mistake that would be, and in the end would die a horrible death. On June 6, 2006, she joined the Marines and headed off to boot camp. Afterward, she was stationed at Camp Lejeune, a military training facility in Jacksonville, North Carolina. On May 13, 2007, 20-year-old Maria called her mother to wish her happy Mother's Day. While on the phone call, she told her mother she had been sexually assaulted a month earlier by her supervisor, Corporal Cesar Armando Lorraine, while on night duty. Mary was horrified and urged her to report the incident to the police. She did as her mother asked, but instead of reporting it to the police, she reported it to the officer in charge. She was then interviewed by the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. However, the officer in charge was not on her side and told the NCIS that Maria was a troublemaker who was trying to seek retribution against Larian, who he described as a stellar Marine. Maria was then assigned a victim advocate and transferred to a different building. However, she remained in the same unit. She continued to pursue charges against Larian, and by the following month, she discovered she was pregnant. As the months went by, those around her tried to encourage her to drop the charges, but Maria wasn't having it. Around early December 2007, Mary planned to visit her daughter, who was now 8 months pregnant. Maria called her on Friday, December 14th, and expressed her excitement for the visit. She also told her mother that she had to attend a mandatory Christmas party and hated the fact that Lorian would also be there. Mary told her to show up to the party, make sure the necessary people saw her, and then leave. She also asked her to call once she arrived back home, but sadly she would never get that call and never heard from her daughter again. The call she got was from Maria's roommate, who told Mary she found a strange note that read, "I cannot take this Marine life anymore. I am leaving. Sorry for the inconvenience." Mary was baffled and extremely confused because the note didn't match the conversation she just had with her daughter earlier that day. So she began to call around trying to find her. However, people dismissed her concerns and said that Maria would probably show back up soon and that there was nothing they could do. Mary then reported her missing to the Jacksonville police, who assured her they would find her. So Mary went home while investigators began looking for her. While there, she received a call from Maria's cell phone. However, excitement quickly faded when a man on the line said he found the phone on the side of the road, about half a mile from Camp Lejeune's main gate. The man had discovered it because he had a flat and didn't have a spare, so he had to walk to find assistance. She thanked him and asked him to drop the phone at the police station, which he did. After Christmas, when there was still no sign of Maria, Mary headed to Jacksonville to find out what was going on. When she arrived, she discovered that a new detective had been assigned to the case. He was a retired Marine who had worked in security for 30 years, and he realized that investigators had never worked on her daughter's case. There was absolutely nothing in Maria's case file, not the alleged note that her roommate found or anything about the man finding her cell phone. So the two went to Camp Lejeune to meet with NCIS. When they arrived, the detective asked to speak with Lorian, but NCIS's response was, and I quote, "Why he had nothing to do with this. I have no clue why they would say that, because Maria disappeared while pregnant and preparing to testify against Lorian for the sexual assault." Their response was most likely because they had done nothing to protect her when she originally reported the crime and instead sided with Lorian. NCIS was hesitant but set up the interview anyway. Mary and the detective also learned that someone had attempted to use Maria's bank card at an ATM on Christmas Eve, and it was called on surveillance. While it was hard to accept, Mary knew Maria was likely gone and vowed to spend the rest of her life if that's what it took to find her. The following month, in January of 2008, investigators got a search warrant to search the backyard of Lorian's house in Jacksonville, Florida. It was there they found a fire pit. When it was removed, they shockingly found Maria's remains. They also found a large amount of Maria's blood inside his home, and it appeared he had tried to clean it up and paint over it. They now had the evidence they needed to arrest him, but he was nowhere to be found. He had fled and left a note which his wife Christina found that claimed that Maria had taken her own life and that he buried her out of fear of being blamed for her death. However, an autopsy proved this information to be false. The autopsy showed that Maria had actually been beaten to death. 3 months later, Larian was found in a small town in Mexico, and in 2009 he was extradited back to the States, and in 2010 he was charged with her murder. Prosecutors determined that Larian needed to get rid of her to keep her from harming his military career. He originally hatched a plan to have her move to Mexico, which would leave her with an AWOL charge and ultimately discredit her. However, he couldn't risk her returning and lured her to his home to look at baby clothes and other items. Once there, he beat her to death with a crowbar. Interestingly, DNA actually showed he wasn't the father of her child. Her blood was later found all over his garage and on a crowbar that he gave to a fellow Marine 2 days after Maria disappeared. He then used her bank card and moved her car around Jacksonville to throw off the investigation. He also built a fire in the pit after he buried her remains. In the end, Larian was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was also found guilty of financial transaction card theft and attempted financial transaction card fraud for using her bank card. Her murderer has since changed the way the Defense Department handles sexual assault allegations. Mildred Lee Matheny was born to parents Jesse and Lizzie Warren in Wilmer, Arkansas on February 28, 1907. She then went on to become a nurse. On October 21, 1931, she married Guy Harmon Matheny and they moved to Little Rock, Arkansas. Sadly, he passed away in 1958. By 1985, 78-year-old Mildred had unfortunately developed dementia and was now living with her sister in Lake Worth, Florida. Sadly, after moving to Florida, a horrible tragedy would occur. Since Mildred had wandered off in the past, which is common with people with dementia, she wasn't typically allowed outside by herself. However, on April 27, 1985, she was able to wander off before anyone noticed and was sadly never seen alive again. Neighbors reported seeing her walking down the street in her pajamas with an orange blouse sometime between 3:30 and 4:00 p.m. on the day she strangely vanished. By 4:30 p.m., when her sister couldn't find her, she reported Mildred missing. 7 hours later, just before 10 p.m., about 30 miles away, a passerby found her naked and unconscious on a dirt road in Jupiter, Florida. She had been beaten and sexually assaulted and was barely hanging on. Sadly, her injuries were too severe, and she died 11 days later on May 8, 1985. Thankfully, evidence was collected from the scene and a sexual assault kit was used. However, even with that, the case would still go unsolved for the next 35 years. In 2019, with hopes of solving the case, the Sheriff's Cold Case Unit released a video with previously unreleased information. That information included a statement from witnesses who had seen Mildred getting into a brown, two-door 1967 Oldsmobile Delta 88 with a young man near Lucerne Avenue about 2 miles from her sister's home. The witnesses questioned the man, who said he was her neighbor and was giving her a ride home. In April 2021, the DNA from the sexual assault kit was uploaded to Cody's and matched to 61-year-old Richard C. Lane Sr., who was 25 at the time of the murder. He was a career criminal, including convictions in 1983 and 1993 for aggravated assault and received probation for each conviction. In 2006 and 2012, he was convicted on weapons charges and received short jail sentences. He was then arrested for the murder and held without bond. In the end, on February 1, 2023, he was convicted of her murder and sentenced to life in prison. Majelik Shandaz Young was born on August 11, 2016, and went by the nickname Jelly, which is short for Jelly Bean. Jelly loved unicorns, pocketbooks, Peppa Pig, and cheesy types. She lived with her father, Darius Young, in Charlotte, North Carolina, but never knew her mother, Malika Bennett. Bennett dropped Majelik off to Darius when she was 3 months old and never returned. That is until Majelik began asking about her mother. Darius was planning a birthday party for her 4th birthday and invited Malika to attend. After the party, he let her take Majelik home with her, believing they could spend the weekend getting to know each other. Sadly, that would be a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Malika told him she would take her swimming and bring her back after the weekend, but that never happened. He made plans to meet her at a park to get Majelic, but she never showed up. He then saw her at a nail shop and said she looked frantic. He then tried going by her home multiple times, but she would never come to the door. He also called the police, who came out and knocked on the door, but once again, nothing. He asked them to check the backyard, but they didn't. He was then told that she would be entered into the system, but he would soon discover that she wasn't after calling the 24-hour child abuse hotline. Thankfully, the person at the child abuse hotline immediately entered the information upon discovering it was missing. On May 21, 2021, detectives went to Malika's home on Braden Drive in Charlotte and upon searching the backyard, found Majelic's body in a shallow grave. They estimated she had been dead since last August, not long after her mother took her. 31-year-old Malika was then arrested and charged with first-degree murder, felony child abuse, inflicting physical injury, and felony concealing a death. She also had 3 misdemeanor child abuse charges from February 2020, 6 months before she took Majelic, charges that Darius was unaware of. Malika's mother, 53-year-old Tammy Taylor Moffett, was also arrested and charged with concealing a death and accessory to murder after the fact. Interestingly, the house where Malika lived and Majelic was found buried had the police called out 77 times since January 2020. The details that led to her death would unfortunately come from Malika's 13-year-old daughter. She said her mother made Majelic stand in the laundry room for 3 days as punishment for having an accident in her pants. During that time, her mother hit and punched Majelic, and made her hold large jars filled with liquid in each hand. She eventually became too weak to stand, fell out the back door and hit her head. She says her mother tried to perform CPR, but it was unsuccessful and Majelic died right where she fell. Malika then placed her body into plastic trash bags and put them in the trunk of her SUV, where it remained for 5 days before the smell became too much. She then bought a shovel and made her 13-year-old daughter pick Angelic up and place her in the shallow grave she dug. She then parked a van over top of it. I wasn't able to find the outcome of Tammy's case, but Malika was offered a plea deal that would have required her to serve 5 years in prison. However, she refused to take it, and in the end, she was found guilty and sentenced to 25 to 31 years in prison. On July 9, 1997, Bailey Troy Gardner was born in Lenexa, Kansas, just outside Kansas City. At 27, he was living in Hendersonville, Tennessee, working as a technical program manager at Amazon. Friends and family said he had a heart of gold. He loved being on the water with his boat and was especially close to his dad, Troy. Late Friday night into early Saturday, June 29, 2024, at Cedar Creek Marina on Old Hickory Lake in Mount Juliet, just outside Nashville, a horrible tragedy unfolded. Just after midnight, the marina's restaurant, the Scoreboard, had closed for the night. Around that same time, 3 masked suspects ambushed employees inside, pistol-whipped 2 of them, and forced them to open the safe. As they fled, Bailey pulled into the parking lot with his boat in tow. One suspect approached the driver's side of his truck and opened fire, shooting Bailey multiple times while he was still in the vehicle. The employees who were assaulted survived, but Bailey was pronounced dead at the scene. Investigators worked quickly using Mount Juliet cameras. The tag came back to 41-year-old Adrian A. McLean of Nashville. 3 weeks after the shooting on July 17, 2024, McLean was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and 3 counts of aggravated robbery. Authorities also noted he had overstayed his visa. 2 accomplices remain at large. 14 months later, in mid-September 2025, a Wilson County jury convicted McLean of first-degree murder and aggravated robbery. Under Tennessee law, the conviction carries a mandatory life sentence. Formal sentencing is currently set for January 9, 2026. Investigators are still seeking the other suspects. Caitlin Jordan Crocker was born May 18, 1999 in Columbia, South Carolina to Harold and Jonna Crocker. At 19, she was living in Winesboro, fun, a little stubborn in the best way, and dreaming big. She graduated Fairfield Central with honors in 2017, earned her cosmetology license, and landed a beauty expert job at the Ulta in Sand Hills. She wanted to do makeup for celebrities one day, but would sadly never get the chance. As for her love life, she was in an on-again, off-again relationship with Alexander Harmon and sometimes stayed at his place in Camden. That's where she was the night of June 2, 2018. Deputies were sent to Harmon's home on Cleveland School Road after his father, calling from New York, told 911 that his son said he'd shot Caitlin and planned to take his own life. When officers arrived, they found Caitlin inside, dead from a gunshot wound to the head. They recovered a 12-gauge shotgun and a spent shell. On body cam, Harmon admitted the shooting and was arrested. Investigators have not publicly offered a specific motive. No robbery, no intruder, just a deadly act inside a troubled relationship. Harmon was booked in 2018 and initially released on a $150,000 surety bond. He missed a court date on November 17, 2023, and a warrant was issued. After more than a year on the run, U.S. Marshals arrested him in Iowa in January 2025, and he was extradited to Kershaw County. On September 19, 2025, the jury found Alexander Harmon guilty of Caitlin's murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. Cheryl Ferguson was born on July 27, 1958, in Long Beach, California. Friends and family describe a big-hearted woman who was fiercely devoted to her son, Philip. At 65, she lived in Anaheim Hills with her husband, former Orange County Judge, Jeffrey Ferguson. Things in the marriage were rocky, to say the least, and Jeffrey had a known drinking problem. Money was always a flashpoint for their arguments, and alcohol only fueled the situation. On August 3, 2023, Jeffrey sat on the bench in court as usual, drinking during the lunch hour and continuing upon arriving home. He and Cheryl ended up at a restaurant that evening where an argument broke out, and as was typical for Jeffrey, in moments of frustration, he made a gun-like gesture toward her. Gestures that Cheryl had relayed to her family. Upon arriving home, the argument continued. Not long after, 911 received a call from Jeffrey saying he'd accidentally shot his wife. Officers arrived to find Cheryl with a single fatal wound. When questioned by police, he stuck to his story that the shooting was an accident. The only problem was he sent a text to court staff that read, "I just lost it. I just shot my wife. I won't be in tomorrow. I will be in custody. I'm so sorry." That text would be the focal point of a case built on his own words, not just for what happened, but why. So what did Jeffrey say really happened? According to him, he was removing his gun from his ankle holster to set it on a cluttered coffee table when he fumbled it because of a shoulder injury and it accidentally discharged. However, investigators weren't buying it. They believed that Jeffrey had shot Cheryl in an angry and intoxicated state. Prosecutors agreed, and he was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. A subsequent search of the home turned up 47 firearms, including the Glock, and more than 26,000 rounds of ammo. During the first trial in March of 2025, one juror felt the evidence wasn't quite enough, leading to an 11-1 deadlock jury. Prosecutors wasted no time in retrying him the very next month. During the second trial, they emphasized his alcohol use. The gun gesture at the restaurant, his firearms training, plus the fact that Glocks are equipped with a safe action system. The system includes a trigger safety lever on the trigger itself, a firing pin safety to block the striker from moving, and a drop safety that ensures the firing pin can only move when the trigger is intentionally pulled. This ensures the pistol only fires when the trigger is deliberately and fully pressed. There was also the very incriminating text message he had sent to his court staff, which led with, "Just lost it." That doesn't sound like an accidental shooting. And the second jury agreed and found him guilty of second-degree murder. To avoid conflicts in Orange County, sentencing was moved to the Los Angeles Superior Court. As the terms of his sentence were read, Jeffrey broke down. Cheryl's brother, Larry Rosen, and Jeffrey's son, Kevin, asked the court for leniency. Both said they believed the shooting was accidental. Larry specifically said that he originally thought Jeffrey had murdered his sister, but felt the evidence during the first trial showed it was a tragic accident. Another brother, Jeff Rosen, said he now regretted ever repeating Cheryl's frustration about Jeffrey's gun gesture during arguments. Philip described parents who argued and loved, and he stood firm that his mother's death was accidental. The judge weighed those pleas but called the case against Jeffrey absolutely overwhelming, citing his post-shooting text to court staff and hours of recorded statements in custody. Those statements included him saying that everyone would hate him, and he even pleaded for a jury to, and I quote, "convict my ass." After being convicted, Jeffrey told the court he loved his wife and understood the verdict, but insisted it was a horrific accident. He asked to remain in Orange County Jail during appeal, prompting the judge to rebuke him again for believing rules didn't apply. However, when all was said and done, 23 jurors across both trials voted guilty. Only one favored involuntary manslaughter. Cheryl's life ended in the home she shared with her husband. Those who loved her speak of generosity and devotion, especially to Philip. That part of her story doesn't waver even as everything else has. Tim Smith was the kind of fella folks counted on. Masters in social work, ran an assisted living community in Ocala, always showed up for his people. 8 years married to Herbert Swilly, who went by Herb, living in the Citrus Park neighborhood with Herb's daughter, Jordan. Weekends, you might catch Tim and Herb easing down the road on a three-wheeler, wind in their faces, and not a care in the world. But come Saturday, March 25, 2023, about 10:45, deputies rolled out for a welfare check. Tim had missed work, which just wasn't like him. They used a landlord's key, stepped inside a little apartment tied to Tim, and the room told a story no one wanted to hear. Injuries to his face and neck, a tight mark at the throat, and that sharp, bleachy smell hanging in the air. Trouble had come calling. Thursday, the 23rd. Tim left work around 4. After that, it's all timestamps and tail lights. Prosecutors said the violence didn't begin in that apartment at all. It started back at the house Tim shared with Herb. Said Tim had an extreme dose of diphenhydramine, Benadryl's sleepy cousin, more than 30 times the usual dentaligature around his neck. Later, they said his body was moved to that small meet-up apartment and staged like a fling gone wrong. Now the defense tried to plant doubt. That apartment saw traffic, dating apps, visitors, mixed DNA. Maybe detectives got tunnel vision, but there was a thread to pull. In the deep hours of March 24th, a white pickup, Herb's, caught on camera headed toward the apartment, then back home. Tim's Jeep shows up there and stays. A figure walks away into the dark. Next morning, deputies enter, find Tim on the floor. Body cam captures the moment they tell Herb his husband is dead. He doesn't ask how, just starts in on where he'd been. Earlier that same day, Herb had called the sheriff, couldn't reach Tim, said 2 nights before they watched TV, went to bed, he left early for the gym, came home to an empty house. Figured Tim went on to work. Investigators later said parts of that tale were false or self-serving. And when they pressed, Herb's lawyer wanted immunity before he'd say another word. Then came more. The couple's Ring camera system accessed the key footage, deleted according to the state. Jordan testified she heard noises that night and helped throw things away at her father's direction. Something she regrets, and that he told her to say he'd been home all night. Neighbors near the house remembered late night shouting around March 23rd, 24th, and cars coming and going. Traffic that stopped cold after the homicide. Friends from AA and Tim's work circle said Herb was bullying about money and about Tim looking at a job out of country with a Zoom interview set for 9 a.m. on the 24th. He never made it. A recruiter said Tim was enthusiastic. Brookdale co-workers described the scramble when he didn't show. The landlord said Tim alone held that lease. On the 25th, Herb asked for entry, said he lost his key. A shop owner and a close friend recalled Herb moving quick, donating Tim's things, cleaning the Jeep so police wouldn't have ammunition, talking insurance and paperwork sooner than felt right. A DNA analyst with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement explained most items showed Tim's DNA. A few mixed profiles fit with the apartment's known use. The defense leaned on that. The state answered with the digital map, Tim's phone, and Herb's truck, leaving home together just before 2 a.m. No credible sign Tim arranged any late-night meet with someone else. And then the why. part heartbreak, part arithmetic. Tim was the primary earner, eyeing that new job and maybe a new start. If he left, the money went with him. If he died, prosecutors said, Herb stood to benefit retirement funds and a life insurance policy around $333,000. After a week of testimony, jurors had the full picture. The drug levels, the ligature, the bleach, the truck and the Jeep, deleted video, tossed drugs, the finances, the plan to move. On Friday, September 19, 2025, they returned a verdict. Herbert Swilly, guilty of premeditated first-degree murder. Judge Robert Hodges handed down life with 687 days time served, and somewhere in Alcala, the elders Tim championed were tended by someone else that weekend. Franz stepped out of a courthouse into the Florida sun, searching for words that fit a man who didn't miss work, didn't miss promises, and this time couldn't come. Not the ending he earned, but at least finally an answer. Abraham Lee Shakespeare was born on April 24, 1966 in Lakeland, Florida. By 43, he was living in Plant City and doing what he'd always done, odd jobs, whatever paid. He unloaded trucks, swept a barber shop, and often rode along on deliveries because he didn't have a driver's license. Friends described him as quiet and soft-hearted. He kept life simple. In 2006, while working as a truck driver's assistant, he stopped with a coworker at the Town Star in Frostproof and sent him in to buy lottery tickets with $2. One of those tickets won $30 million. Abraham chose the lump sum of approximately $17 million. Despite the windfall, he did not go on a spree. He bought a modest small mansion, a Nissan Altima, and a pawn shop Rolex and little else. As news of his winning spread, the request for money began. Late mortgages, cars close to repossession, help with funeral costs. Abraham gave generously again and again. He had 2 sons, Moses and Jeremiah, and while he struggled with reading and writing and wasn't much for texting, people knew his voice and noticed when messages didn't sound like him. In 2008, Doris D.D. Moore entered his life, saying she wanted to write a book about his rags to riches story. She ran a nursing staffing company and presented herself as polished and helpful. She formed Abraham Shakespeare LLC, placed herself between Abraham and others, and told him she would organize debts and handle those who owed him money. Prosecutors later said more than $1 million flowed to Moore's lifestyle, cars, trips, and personal expenses. In April 2009, Abraham went quiet. There was no note and no goodbye. His family initially wondered if he had stepped away because of the constant pressure, and he was not reported missing until November. In the meantime, messages continued, "I'm fine and I'm away." And even his mother received a call. It was not Abraham. According to investigators, Moore pushed Greg Smith to pretend it was. Police soon brought Smith in to help. He recorded conversations with Moore, at times hiding a device in a Red Bull can. On tape, she discussed digging and moving a body. She produced the .38 used in the killing, advised on filing off the serial number, and even mentioned wiping her prints from the laser sight battery. She then took Smith to a Plant City property connected to her circle, held in her boyfriend's name, and indicated where Abraham had been buried. In January 2010, deputies cut through fresh concrete in the backyard, a slab roughly 30 by 30 feet. About 5 feet down, they found Abraham's body. He'd been shot twice in the chest with a .38. Prosecutors set the date of murder at April 6, 2009, when Abraham was 43. The Polk County Sheriff's Office led much of the casework, and Hillsborough County handled the recovery scene. Moore offered alternate explanations, claiming a drug dealer named Ronald was responsible. But prosecutors said Ronald was a fiction. Other details emerged. Lime bags in the narrative, an offer of $50,000 to someone to take the fall, attempts to have the grave moved, the promise of a $200,000 house to any relative willing to lie and say they had seen Abraham alive, and a $5,000 birthday drop arranged from Abraham to keep up the illusion. Before the murder investigation, there had been a civil dispute. Abraham's co-worker, Michael Ford, sued, claiming the winning ticket came from his wallet. A jury rejected the claim and Abraham prevailed. The peace did not last. In December 2012, a jury found Doris D.D. Moore guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life without parole. At sentencing, the judge described her as the most manipulative person he had seen, and called the killing cold, calculated, and cruel. Interestingly, Antoinette Andrews, the mother of Abraham's son Moses, years later won a $1 million scratch-off prize. It was a strange echo of Abraham's life-changing moment, though under very different circumstances. Abraham Shakespeare's story is remembered as a rise from humble work to sudden wealth, followed by relentless demands for help, and the entry of the wrong person at the center of his finances. He doubted text because he trusted people, and that trust was exploited with devastating results. Cassie Jo Stoddard was born on December 21, 1989 to Anna Cicernos and Ronald Stoddard. At 16, she was a junior at Pocatello High, creative, into music and gentle with animals. If she said she'd do something, she did it. Her grandparents helped raise the kids for a time, and that family-first rhythm stuck. In September 2006, Cassie agreed to house-sit for her aunt and uncle, Frank and Allison Contreras. They'd moved from the Bay Area in 2005 with their blended family and had settled into a quiet place off 2.5 Mile Road, a 2-acre property with about 1,600 square feet of living space, fenced pastures, a garage, and pets to care for. On the evening of September 22nd, Cassie's boyfriend, Matt, came over. They watched Kill Bill Volume 2, two classmates, Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk. Also 16, stopped by, briefly said they were heading to a movie, and left. On the way out, they quietly unlocked the basement door. They came back dressed in dark clothing, wearing gloves and white mask. From the basement, they flipped a breaker. The lights stuttered. Cassie grew uneasy. Matt called his mom to ask if he could stay. She said no, but offered to take Cassie home. Cassie chose to remain, because she'd promised to watch the house and the animals. As Matt left, he called Tori, who whispered that he was at the theater. He couldn't describe the movie later. When Cassie didn't come downstairs, they went up. Brian carried a dagger-style knife. Tori had a hunting knife. They slammed a closet door to startle her. When she moved toward the sound, they attacked. Approximately 30 wounds, mostly to the chest and neck. The medical examiner later noted multiple deep injuries to the torso. Around a dozen could have been fatal on their own. 2 different knives were used. Afterward, they recorded themselves in a car, amped and performative. 2 days later, on September 24th, the Contreras family returned home. Their 13-year-old daughter found Cassie in the living room. They called 911. Detectives moved quickly. Prints on the breaker door initially pointed to a man close to Cassie's mom, but he'd done electrical work there months earlier and was cleared. Attention turned to Matt, the last person to see Cassie alive. He passed a polygraph and his timeline held. Investigators then focused on Draper and Adamczyk. They first claimed they'd seen Pulse, but couldn't describe anything about it. A search of Brian's room turned up a knife sheath under the bed. In a later interview, Brian broke, first saying Tori stabbed while he watched, then admitting he stabbed Cassie in the leg after Tori pushed him. He led detectives to Black Rock Canyon, where they had hidden several items. Their police recovered knives, masks, gloves, clothing, and a Sony camcorder tape that needed repair but played. Some items had Cassie's blood on them. The pair had also bought matches that night, undercutting their theater alibi. An 18-year-old friend, Joe Lucero, told investigators he purchased 4 knives at a pawn shop for $45, $40 from Draper, and $5 from Adamczyk. One was serrated. Draper claimed that one. On September 27th, with his father present, Tori acknowledged the court events. Both teens were arrested and charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy. In court, the tapes were played. Their fixations, Scream, Columbine, serial killers, were laid out for the jury. Both were found guilty and sentenced to life without parole for murder plus 30 to life for conspiracy. Later, Draper's conspiracy conviction was vacated on a jury instruction issue, but his murder conviction and life without parole sentence stood. Both remain incarcerated at the Idaho State Correctional Institute in Kuna. The impact on the homeowners was profound. The Contreras had been in Idaho for just a year. Allison lost her job and fell into depression. Frank picked up a second job and began drinking. Their stepdaughter suffered a breakdown after reporting that she saw Cassie in the house. They listed the property and wanted out, but it took years to sell. For a period, Allison and their 12-year-old son stayed there without Frank while they waited for a buyer. Each appeal kept what happened alive inside those walls. Cassie's immediate family carried their own grief. Her parents, Anna and Ronald, had to rebuild around the absence. Her siblings, Andrew and Christy, grew up with a before and an after. Andrew has said it took years before they could even talk about it. In 2022, Anna passed away after a fight with cancer. Another loss folded into the first. Cassie did exactly what she said she would do. Watch the house, care for the pets, trust friends. She should have had a future. Heather Suzanne Stroop was born on April 20th, 1984 to Mary and Buddy Allen. She grew up in Snailville, Georgia, graduated from Shallow High, and split her college years between Auburn and Perimeter, working toward a business degree. By 25, she was living in Covington with her 18-month-old son, Carson. She worked as a florist. She was a hands-on mom, and as she and her husband, Stephen, moved through a divorce, they shared custody, structured, predictable, tense in the way these things can be. Sunday, April 26, 2009, was supposed to be routine. Heather drove to the Target in Snailville for the handoff. Same public lot, same time window. Stephen pulled in. They spoke briefly and he buckled Carson into Heather's SUV. Witnesses saw him drive off. Heather turned back toward her driver's door. The day still felt ordinary. It wasn't. A figure in a dark wig and fake mustache stepped into her path. Close enough to block the door, close enough to argue. Heather tried to sidestep toward the handle. The other person pushed the door closed. She called out for help to a passing motorist. Then a handgun came out of a black messenger bag and pressed to her forehead. One shot. The shooter turned and walked away, disappearing toward nearby storefronts as stunned bystanders reached for their phones. Early descriptions pegged the killer as a man. Later, as people replayed what they'd seen and as a video circulated, more than one witness realized the gait and frame looked like a woman's. Police fanned out. A K-9 team picked up a trail and lost it. From the start, investigators believed the attack wasn't random. It happened in minutes, in full daylight, and hit at the exact moment when Heather would be separated from Stephen and standing beside her SUV. That pointed to planning, to someone who knew their custody routine. They interviewed the circle who knew about the weekly exchange, family, friends, anyone who might benefit from Heather being gone. Stephen was first up. He'd driven away before the shot and his alibi that evening, car wash. Then his girlfriend checked out. Even so, detectives kept the door open to the possibility of a murder for hire. A composite sketch of the disguised shooter went public, but didn't crack the case. Then a lead surfaced from behind the shopping center. A long-haul trucker parked at the hotel there had noticed a white Ford F-150 extended cab pickup in the same area the day before the shooting and again on Sunday, occupied by a person wearing a wig and mustache who sped off when they realized they'd been watched. When investigators later drove past a suspect street, the trucker picked out the same type of white Ford parked at that home. The focus tightened on 45-year-old Joanna Hayes, Heather's mother-in-law. Detectives asked where she'd been that Sunday. Hayes produced a small receipt to prove she'd been miles away, near Noonan, around 7:19 p.m. On its face, the slip looked exculpatory, but investigators did the drive themselves. Leaving the Snailville lot at 6 p.m., obeying the speed limit, they reached the spot on the receipt in roughly an hour and 20 minutes. Enough time to commit the murder, leave, and still make that purchase. In Hayes' white pickup, technicians also recovered a dark synthetic fiber consistent with wig material. Detectives decided to press. They showed Stephen the surveillance footage from the lot. His reaction was immediate and visceral. His reaction was immediate and visceral. "It looks just like you, walks like you," he told his mother during a recorded call. In court weeks later, jurors heard that recording. Hayes denied everything in interviews and walked out. As the grand jury convened and the case moved toward trial, more context surfaced. A florist who'd spent Valentine's Day 2008 working with Hayes told jurors about a chilling conversation in which Hayes laid out how she'd commit a perfect murder. Use a credit card at the right time somewhere distant. Don't use a distinctive vehicle. Buy a revolver off the books. Destroy it with a grinder or torch and dump the remains. In jail, 2 separate inmates said Hayes railed about Heather's parenting and admitted she'd shot her in the front of the head. Ballistics experts testified the killing was consistent with a .38 caliber revolver, Rossi or Taurus, though no weapon was ever recovered. The state had no gun, no wig, no DNA, and multiple witnesses who initially thought the shooter was a man. What they had was the choreography of the crime, the timing test that turned an alibi receipt into a problem. The trucker's identification of Hayes' white F-150, a fiber consistent with a wig, recorded calls that shook her own son, and testimony about motive centered entirely on Carson, on control, access, and family lines drawn far too tightly. On May 19, 2011, the jury found Joanna Hayes guilty of malice murder and related charges. Days later, the court sentenced her to life in prison plus 5 years on the firearm count. Under Georgia law, she's eligible to seek parole after 30 years. Appeals followed and were rejected. In March 2013, the Georgia Supreme Court affirmed the convictions. After Heather's murder, Carson stayed with his maternal grandparents. When Mary died from surgical complications in 2014, Buddy kept raising him quietly, steadily the way Heather would have wanted, present, protective, and putting Carson first, and he still is to this day. Jana Troxell Murray was born on November 22, 1980 in Wichita, Kansas to David and Phyllis Murray. By 30, she had moved from Houston to the D.C. area, living in Arlington, Virginia, and working just over the line. She chased school with intention, 2 years at St. Louis University's Madrid campus, a B.S. from George Washington University, and she was nearing completion of a dual master's in communication and business at Johns Hopkins in Washington, D.C. After 5 years with Halliburton, she shifted into retail leadership as a sales team lead at Lululemon. She loved animals, dance, and travel, and she gave her time to multiple volunteer efforts. Friends and family described her as focused and competitive in the best sense. On the morning of March 12, 2011, the Lululemon manager unlocked the Bethesda store and walked into disorder. The front door unsecured, merchandise scattered, mannequins askew, lights still on in back. With help from a passerby waiting for the Apple store next door, she searched. Jana was found face down in a narrow rear hallway, in blood, with a ligature around her neck. In the bathroom, Brittany Norwood lay on the floor, apparently semi-conscious, wrist and ankle zip-tied, blood on her face. Bloody footprints wound through the cell's floor. The manager called 911, then called again after the bystander confirmed what he had seen. 911, what is the emergency? She's tied up. One person seems dead and the other person is breathing. Norwood initially reported that she had forgotten her wallet after closing and returned with Jana's help. Alarm data showed the door was reopened at 10:05 p.m. She claimed 2 masked intruders entered, attacked both women, and sexually assaulted them. Investigators began with that account, but the evidence quickly eroded it. Jana's injuries were catastrophic, at least 331 distinct wounds. 5 or more weapons appeared to have been used, including a knife and a hammer likely pulled from an in-store toolbox. By contrast, Norwood's injuries were minor and consistent with self-infliction. A forensic expert later testified that blood on Norwood's face ran straight down, indicating she had been upright for most of the night rather than bound on a bathroom floor. Footprint evidence told the same story. 2 sources were identified. A pair of men's size 14 Reebok sneakers found inside the store and Norwood's own shoes. The larger prints tracked through the scene and ended before any exit, consistent with staging rather than intruders entering and leaving. There was no evidence of sexual assault. Investigators concluded a cut in Jana's pants had been made to create that impression. Employees at the Apple store next door reported hearing an escalating disturbance the night before, raised female voices through the shared wall. Surveillance from inside the Apple store showed staff pausing near that wall, while a nearby security guard listened to music through headphones. Detectives also found blood in Jana's car. Lab work identified a mixture from both women. The vehicle was located 3 blocks away at a farmer's market. When questioned, Norwood acknowledged moving the car and said she had been forced to do so. She also said she had seen a police officer while driving but had not stopped to ask for help. As the timeline settled, a likely motive emerged. After closing, Jana and Norwood completed a routine bag check. Standard loss prevention. Jana found a pair of Lululemon pants in Norwood's bag and notified a manager to address it in the morning. Soon after, Norwood contacted Jana to be let back inside. When Jana returned, Norwood attacked her, moved Jana's car, and staged the store. She put on the size 14 sneakers to track blood, tossed cleaning tools and chairs to simulate a struggle, cut herself, and zip-tied her own wrist and ankles before waiting for morning. A week later, police arrested Brittany Norwood and charged her with first-degree murder. Early witnesses at trial included the store manager, a Montgomery County police officer and corporal, an EMT, and the bystander who helped search the shop. Their testimony outlined the scene: an unlocked door, a ransacked floor, a tight, bloody corridor where Jana's body blocked the doorway, and Norwood alive but bound in the restroom. The officer who arrived first noted Norwood's lack of response and flinched to touch. At the hospital, the bottoms of Norwood's socks were observed to be saturated with blood, while investigators documented a toolbox, box cutters, and a length of rope near Jana's head, as well as blood on the bar of the rear emergency exit. The EMT reported Norwood's moans, brief eye-opening and rapid breathing. Prosecutors argued premeditation. The defense argued a fight that turned fatal. On January 27, 2012, a jury found Norwood guilty of first-degree murder, and she received a life sentence. She has been incarcerated at the Maryland Correctional Institution for Women. After her death, her family created the Jana Troxell Murray Foundation to carry forward the causes she cared about. They also maintain a small Etsy shop with handcrafted ornaments and similar items in her honor. Reginald Antoine Kwaku was born on October 4, 1991. By 24, Reggie had moved from Hialeah, Florida to Fayetteville, Georgia, just south of Atlanta. He loved bodybuilding and reading, set goals, and most of all, worked security at the Blue Flame Lounge, a place friends said felt like family. The job meant risk and generous cash tips, so he carried a license .45. On April 24, 2016, just before midnight, gunfire erupted in the Burger King lot across from the Blue Flame on Donald Lee Hollowell Parkway. Officers found a Pontiac Bonneville riddled with bullets, Reggie dead in the driver's seat, and his friend, 22-year-old Quincy, which collapsed in the lot. Quincy was rushed to the hospital where he died. On the seat, Reggie's .45. On the ground, .40 caliber casings, evidence of a second gun. Surveillance from a nearby business showed the Bonneville back into a space as a dark Pontiac G8 pulled alongside. After the burst, a man bolted and lost a flip-flop as he ran. Hours later, police stopped a one-sandaled man, 28-year-old Carlton Redding. He said he'd borrowed his girlfriend's Bonneville to drive Reggie to a quick weed-buy. Quincy arranged. Then a heavy-set fourth man in the back seat pulled a gun, demanded money, and shots erupted from inside the Bonneville. A video corroborated a fourth person and that the shots came from inside the car. Detectives pulled Quincy's phone. A contact labeled Big Nick led to 25-year-old Nicholas Benton. Phone records showed a flurry of calls among Reggie, Quincy, and Benton in the hours before the killings, and a text from Quincy to Big Nick that read one strap, slang for a single gun. Investigators concluded Quincy helped set up a robbery of his friend, and Benton opened fire with a .40, killing both men. Ballistics tied the murders to the .40, not Reggie's .45. Police arrested Nicholas Benton on June 6, 2016. He was convicted of murder, felony murder, attempted armed robbery, and related charges, and he was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Brands remembered Reggie as courageous and giving, a young man building a future who trusted the wrong people on the wrong night. Denise Annette Hubert was born in Modesto, California on November 22, 1967. After high school, she earned a degree in social sciences from the University of California, Irvine, and then moved back in with her parents in Newport Beach. She was described as a very social individual with lots of friends. In 1991, 24-year-old Denise was working as a server at the Old Spaghetti Factory. On the night of June 2nd, she and a coworker named Robert Calvert went to a Morrissey concert in Inglewood after her boyfriend, Stephen Horrocks, was unable to go. Unfortunately, when she was less than 3 miles from home, her rear tire blew out on the Corona del Mar freeway. When her parents woke up the next morning and realized she wasn't in her room, they assumed she spent the night at Rob's place or maybe her friend Tammy Brown's house. She called Tammy that morning to see if Denise was there, but sadly she wasn't. She in turn called Rob, who said the last time he saw her was when she dropped him off at home after the concert. Tammy then decided to drive the route that Denise would have taken. That's when she discovered Denise's car with a flat tire on the side of the freeway just before the Newport Beach exit. Unfortunately, Denise was nowhere to be found, and missing along with her were her car keys and purse. Police began searching the area with helicopters and canine units. The dogs were able to track her scent for about 75 yards before it vanished. They brought Rob in for questioning, who said he and Denise had gone for drinks at a local bar after the concert, and that she dropped him off around 2 a.m. He agreed to a polygraph and passed. Rob told investigators about Denise's boyfriend, Steve, but he had a solid alibi and was also ruled out. A few years later, retirees Jack and Elaine Court had moved to Prescott Valley, Arizona, and began selling paint supplies at a local swap meet. In July of 1994, they met a new vendor by the name of John, who sold painting-related items. John invited the couple out to his house to see his inventory, and they agreed with the hopes of buying stuff for their business. However, when they arrived at his house, they saw a 24-foot yellow Ryder moving truck parked in the back driveway and found that very strange. Regardless, they bought their supplies and left, but Elaine couldn't get the thought of that truck out of her mind. Thinking it might be stolen, they went back and secretly wrote down the license plate number. They then gave the plate information to a customer of theirs who worked as a deputy. After running the plate, it turns out Elaine was right. The truck had been reported stolen about 6 months earlier. After discovering that, he called in the location of the stolen Ryder truck, and a deputy took the call and went to John's house. However, when he arrived, no one was home. He then decided to check the truck out for himself and noticed some things that made him think John was using the truck as a drug lab. For instance, there were chemicals sitting outside the truck, and there was an extension cord running from the back over to the neighbor's house. It would later be revealed that that house belonged to his mother. The officer worked quickly, and less than an hour later, the narcotics team was there with a search warrant and opened the truck. Inside, they found a padlocked deep freezer, which they assumed was filled with drugs. Officers had no clue they were about to discover the remains of Denise. She was found on her knees with her arms handcuffed behind her back, and her mouth was duct-taped shut. While there, John, whose full name is John Joseph Familaro, arrived back home but didn't seem bothered by the presence of law enforcement. After arresting him for the truck theft, they brought him back to the station for questioning. At first, he was being oddly cooperative, that is until they mentioned the freezer. At that point, he refused to talk and requested an attorney. He was then arrested and charged with murder and grand theft auto. Meanwhile, officers began searching John's home while the medical examiner's office was trying to determine the identity of the woman found in the freezer. As they entered his basement, they found blood and tissue, as well as women's clothing, purses, and social security cards. At the back of the basement was a dugout hidden underground room. At this point, they were thinking they were going to discover more bodies and brought in a cadaver dog, but came up empty-handed. Before John moved to Arizona in the summer of 1992, he was renting a warehouse in California. Investigators searched the building and found dried blood, but still no other victims. At that point, they began contacting other agencies, which eventually led them to a woman who had a horrible experience with him. She said after meeting him in Phoenix, Arizona, he drove her out into the middle of the desert and proceeded to strangle her. Thankfully, she was able to fight him off and escape. Unfortunately, she never reported the incident to the police. However, she never forgot his face and immediately picked him out of a photo lineup. Once she came forward, it prompted other victims to come forward and share their stories. Multiple women said he had handcuffed them to beds without their consent, while others talked about his violent and disturbing behavior. Eventually, they were able to identify the remains as belonging to Denise. Inside his home, they found her purse with her identification inside, along with her clothes and newspaper clippings about her disappearance. He had even recorded an episode of Inside Edition that featured Denise's case. Since the warehouse where he ran his painting business in Laguna Hills, California was not far from where Denise's car was found. Investigators theorized he stumbled upon Denise while she was trying to fix the flat on her car. They believe he struck her with a hammer and drove her back to the warehouse where he proceeded to sexually assault her. Once done, he killed her. Luminol was sprayed on a room in the back of the warehouse and revealed lots of blood on the walls. As to why he killed Denise's body, investigators say he was a hoarder and could never throw anything away. John has since been dubbed the Icebox Killer, and in 1994, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. Strangely, they've never found any other bodies. It could be that Denise was his first murder victim, especially considering the lengths he went to preserve the body. Plus, it's possible he dug out the area in his basement in preparation for more murders. It's now been 30 years since he was sentenced to death, but as of 2024, he is still awaiting execution at California's San Quentin State Prison. Judith Weaver was born and raised in Everett, Washington, and went by Judy. Judy was described as street smart and a very likable person. When she was 17 years old, she was crowned the queen of a local beauty pageant. In 1984, 42-year-old Judy was living in an apartment in Everett and was the co-owner of Bell Nest Cafe. She worked there along with her mother, Edith Peralt, and her daughter, Kathy Myers. After work on the night of June 1, 1984, she began her walk home and stopped by a Dairy Queen where she ordered some ice cream. Sadly, that was the last time she was ever seen alive. A little after midnight on June 2nd, a passerby noticed a fire at Judy's one-story apartment building and used a payphone to call 911. When firefighters arrived and entered her apartment, they found that the fire was contained to her bedroom and the bedroom door was closed. The smoke was so thick they had to crawl into the room. Once inside, they found her body lying on a burning bed. After putting out the flames, they found Judy tied up and strangled to death with a phone cord. Thankfully, the fire didn't destroy all the evidence. Interestingly, the fire was started on her bed using a paper towel stuck in a jar of Pond's cold cream. With little to no leads, the case would then go unsolved for the next 40 years. In 2022, detectives with the Everett Police Department decided to submit evidence from the crime scene to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab with the hopes that DNA could be extracted. After generating a DNA profile, it was uploaded to Cody's, and to their surprise, they got a match to 66-year-old Mitchell Gaff. In order to further prove his DNA matched the DNA from the crime scene, they came up with a very unique idea. They approached Gaff and said they were doing a survey on gum flavors to determine which one consumers liked the best. He then proceeded to try different pieces of gum, and upon discarding each one of them, the undercover detectives kept the pieces and had them tested for DNA. The results, once again, proved that Gaff's DNA matched the DNA collected from pieces of fabric that were used to bind her wrists. Come to find out, Gaff was a level 3 sex offender, which means the state has determined he is at a high risk of reoffending. In 1979, he was convicted for the assault of a woman that he had forced to the ground with a gun while she was putting her lawnmower away in her garage. He bound her and repeatedly hit her with his pistol, but thankfully she was able to get away. For that crime, he was given a 5-year suspended sentence along with probation, meaning he never served any of his time. 2 months after Judy's murder, 26-year-old Gaff was arrested for attacking 2 sisters while they slept in their home. He then sexually assaulted them after tying them up with a telephone extension cord. Thankfully, one of the sisters escaped and got help. Gaff confessed that at one point he was attacking anywhere from 10 to 30 women a day by knocking them to the ground and putting his hands up their skirts. He was also more active during the summer months because he had a thing for women in skimpy clothes. For the attack on the sisters, he pleaded guilty and was determined to unfit to continue living in the community and was committed for 11 years. The state also labeled him, and I quote, a sexually violent predator. After being released in 2006, he changed his name to Sam Wise Price. On May 1, 2024, he was arrested and charged with first-degree murder for the death of Judy. He was also charged with first-degree sexual assault, first-degree arson, first-degree kidnapping, and first-degree burglary. Investigators could also find no evidence that Judy and Gaff knew each other. This is very important because a person can always claim to know their victim to explain why their DNA was found in the apartment. Gaff never did that and instead invoked his right to remain silent and pleaded not guilty. As of June 2024, his trial date is still pending and he is being held without bail. Pava Marie Lapierre was born on January 21, 1997 in Tucson, Arizona. After high school, she enrolled in the computer science program at Johns Hopkins University in 2019 before changing her major to sociology because she wanted to use entrepreneurship to improve societal inequalities. By 2023, 26-year-old Pava was living in Baltimore, Maryland, where she was CEO of EcoMap Technologies, a company she founded with Sherrod Davis. The company was very successful, and she even made the Forbes 30 Under 30 list in the social impact category. Pava was making a huge impact on the world until her life was sadly cut short by an evil individual. On Friday night, September 22, 2023, all communications with Pava suddenly stopped. By the 25th, when friends and family had still not heard from her, they reported her missing. That same day, Pava was found murdered on the rooftop of her apartment building. She had tragically been beaten and strangled to death. Investigators were able to retrieve security footage from the building and saw her right before her murder in the lobby of the building, letting an unknown man inside after he waved at her. Sadly, this would be the biggest mistake of her life. After letting him in, they could be seen conversing before entering the elevator together. After that, she was never seen alive again. That same man was caught again on camera about 40 minutes later, coming out of a stairwell and quickly exiting the building while wiping his right hand on his shorts. It would later be discovered that he had been following Pava as she walked home that evening. The man was later identified as 32-year-old convicted violent sex offender Jason Dean Billingsley. At the time, he was on supervised probation after being released early from prison for another crime. He has a lengthy criminal record with arrest in 2009, 2011, and 2013 for sex offenses, assault charges, and burglary. Come to find out, he was also wanted in connection with attempted murder, arson, and sexual assault that occurred 3 days before Pava was murdered. In 2015, he was convicted of a first-degree sex offense charge and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. However, because he took a plea deal and pleaded guilty, he was only required to serve 14 years, but that was cut down to 7 years after receiving credit for good behavior. After murdering Pava, he went on the run. During that time, his mother made a plea for him to turn himself in. On September 27th, U.S. Marshals located him near a train station in Bowie, Maryland, and took him into custody. He was then charged with Pava's murder and even confessed to the crime. Since Pava's death, her parents, along with Maryland Governor Wes Moore, endorsed legislation to restrict sex offenders from earning good time credits. In May of 2024, that bill was passed and will hopefully keep sex offenders from being released early for good behavior. As of June 2024, it appears his case is still going through legal proceedings, and he remains in jail without bail. Samantha Nicole Heller was born on January 16, 1995 in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and went by the nickname Sammy. In December 2012, 17-year-old Sammy was a senior at McCaskey High School and was described as a very funny and social individual who made friends easily. She enjoyed playing softball and field hockey and enjoyed riding horses and motorcycles. When she was 15, she met and fell in love with 17-year-old Benjamin Daniel Klinger. However, her friends and family were less than thrilled with him and described him as having a very dark and distant personality. They also described their relationship as very volatile. Unfortunately, all attempts to keep Sammy away from him were unsuccessful. Over time, her relationship with Ben began to change her, and she eventually lost her humor and the social spark that she had been known for. No matter what Ben did, she would always take him back after he apologized. Sadly, her relationship with Ben eventually led to a horrible tragedy. Over time, his abusive and controlling nature toward her worsened. He had threatened to kill her and even pushed her down a set of stairs once. At some point, he ran over her foot with his car and was distributing illicit photos of her. At that point, she had enough and decided to press charges against him in June 2012. For running over her foot, he was charged with assault. For the next 6 months, they didn't see each other, and Sammy's family said she was slowly returning to normal. Plus, during that time, Ben got a new girlfriend, which made him even angrier about the charges that were pressed against him and the fact that Sammy's mother was trying to get charges against him for distributing photos of a minor. If those charges went through, it would require Ben to register as a sex offender. However, he wasn't going down lightly and came up with a plan to get rid of Sammy. It's unclear how he coaxed her into his car, but on December 4, 2012, Sammy was riding with him near Route 283 in Raffo Township when he accelerated his Toyota sedan to about 100 miles per hour. Sammy, probably knowing this wasn't going to end well, sent her mom a final text saying, and I quote, "I love you, Mama." He then intentionally drove the car into a guardrail. Unfortunately, Sammy wasn't wearing her seatbelt and was thrown from the car but was still alive. Ben, on the other hand, was wearing his seatbelt. It's possible Ben wouldn't let her put the seatbelt on if his plan was to kill her, or he could have removed it before he crashed the car. When other motorists came upon the accident, they saw Ben on top of her and heard her screaming, "Get off of me." By the time emergency services arrived, she was dead. Apparently, when the crash failed, he suffocated her to death by sitting on her. I know a lot of y'all are going to ask why witnesses didn't help her, and honestly, I have no answer for that. I've seen that question asked in the comment section of other videos regarding this case, and pretty much everyone is dumbfounded. After the accident, Ben was taken to the hospital where he told his new girlfriend, "At least now you don't have to worry about her getting between me and you." Upon hearing that, investigators knew they had a motive for the murder, then clearly felt that the charges against him were going to take him away from his new girlfriend. He even wrote on Facebook, I quote, "Sometimes you have to give up what you love most to get what you will love more." On December 9th, he was charged with felony counts of disseminating explicit material regarding the photos of Sammy. 17 days after her murder on December 21, 2012, Ben was arrested at his home and charged with a straight homicide instead of vehicular homicide, aggravated assault by vehicle, reckless endangerment, drug possession, and several traffic violations. Another shocking layer of the murder is that Ben thought she was pregnant either by him or another man when he decided to take her life. It was later determined she wasn't, but he didn't know that when he murdered her. In the end, he took a plea deal and pleaded guilty to third-degree murder and was sentenced to 28 to 56 years behind bars. After receiving the long sentence, he tried to take back the guilty plea and claimed his attorney gave him bad advice. Thankfully, the judge rejected his claim. Bethany Ann Israel was born in Minneapolis on September 11, 1993 to Mark and Judy Ball. Bethany was described as a kind and compassionate individual. In high school, she played basketball and volleyball and also had a love for music, eventually learning how to play the flute. After high school, she attended Howells-Anderson College and then earned her master's degree in education from Maranatha Baptist University. She had a passion for teaching and volleyball, eventually coaching at the Hammerhead Club and then at Breck High School. While at the Apple Valley Volleyball Open Gym, she met and fell in love with Josh Israel. Together, they traveled around exploring places such as Jamaica and Mexico. Then on April 30, 2021, during the height of the COVID pandemic, she and Josh eloped in Jamaica. By May of 2024, they were living in Bloomington, Minnesota, and 30-year-old Bethany was 17 to 18 weeks pregnant with their first child. Sadly, she would never get the chance to experience motherhood. On May 23, 2024, around 6 p.m., Bethany went to her 23-year-old brother Jack Joseph Ball's home for dinner. After arriving, all communications with her and her brother suddenly stopped. Within a few hours, her family had become extremely concerned when they couldn't get in touch with either of them. Her mother then decided to drive over to her son's home to find out what was going on. She arrived just in time to see him fleeing the home. Around 11 p.m., she entered the home just enough to see a large amount of blood. After deciding not to go any further, she stepped back outside and called 911. On the call, she told the operator she believed her daughter was dead inside. When officers arrived and entered the home, they shockingly found Bethany dead on the kitchen floor with some of her body parts missing. Sadly, her unborn son was also killed during the attack. As they searched the home, they found a bloody saw, hatchet, and multiple bloody knives. The mother was asked where she thought her son might have gone, and she said the cemetery in Rosemont because they had relatives buried there. As police searched for Jack and the missing body parts, a 911 call came in from a person in Rosemont, about 5 miles away from the crime scene, saying they witnessed a man on their Ring doorbell camera placing what appeared to be body parts on the front step. When authorities arrived, they found more of Bethany's remains and also noticed Jack's car parked in a nearby driveway. They continued searching and eventually found him near a shed covered in blood with some more of the missing body parts. He apparently tried to take his own life, but was still conscious and talking. He was then rushed to a nearby hospital. Everyone was baffled until the investigators found his journals and handwritten papers that spoke of his anger toward his sister for getting pregnant. Had written that his sister was, and I quote, no longer innocent. It's possible that Jack was struggling with serious mental health issues, which caused him to take his religious beliefs to the extreme. After Jack was admitted to the hospital, he was charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder for killing Bethany and her unborn child. I'm sure we'll be hearing a lot more about this case as the court proceedings begin to ramp up. But as of May 27th, he was still in the hospital. Once he is medically cleared, he will be transferred to the Dakota County Jail. Anna Repkina was born in 1990 in Moscow, Russia. In 2016, after getting out of a 7-year relationship, she went on a dating website and met a man named William Hargrove, who lived in Uzi, Oregon. The relationship quickly blossomed, and before long, she was making plans to come to the United States to meet him. During the holidays of that year, she spent a total of 10 days with William, and at the end of the trip, he asked her to marry him. She agreed, but had to return to Russia to make plans to permanently move to the United States. 3 months later, in March of 2017, she left her life in Russia and returned to Oregon with the plans to settle down and get married. However, unbeknownst to her, the man she was about to marry wasn't all he was cracked up to be. William, who worked as a mechanic at a local car dealership, was having an affair with his married landlady, Michelle Chavez, who was married to a professor who taught at Oregon State University. William lived in their home, along with the couple's 2 children. The affair had been going on the entire time he was wooing Anna, and he had no plans to stop it. William and Michelle had met while she was working as a bouncer at a bar, and before long, she offered to rent him a room at her home. Sadly, because of the affair, Anna would never get married. William would become the prime suspect in a murder case, and I kid you not when I say that somehow time travel became part of this case. Anna and William were supposed to get married on March 23, 2017, but William called it off and told her it was because the officiant couldn't show up on that day. However, he told Michelle a different story. He said he wasn't in love with Anna and was going to send her back to Russia. In the meanwhile, Michelle had forced William to move out of her home and into another place with Anna because she didn't like her being around. She also broke things off with her husband in order to be with William. However, 3 weeks later, Anna was still there and Michelle was pissed. So she gave him an ultimatum, either get rid of Anna or she was done. On April 16, 2017, a groundskeeper near Isle C, Oregon came upon Anna's body. She had sadly been shot to death. The trash that lay on the ground beside her was just as shocking. We're talking candy wrappers, fast food bags with a receipt from KFC and cigarette cartons. She had basically flown 5,000 miles to be with who she thought was the love of her life, only to be thrown away like a piece of trash. The KFC receipt that was found was dated April 14th, 2 days before Anna's body was discovered. Investigators were able to trace the receipt right back to William. They then discovered that after she was dead, he withdrew $800 from her bank account. He then used the money to buy candy and cigars and pay for his car insurance. He also bought some Star Wars Legos. Investigators knew they had their prime suspect, but they needed to know why he murdered Anna. Police tracked down Kevin Thomas, a friend of William's, who had eaten with him that day at KFC. He told investigators about the love triangle that had turned sour. He also said that William borrowed a shotgun from him that day and never returned it, the exact type of weapon that was used to murder Anna. Based on the testimony by Kevin, investigators were able to piece together a timeline of events. They determined that on the day Anna's body was found, William took her into the woods and shot her to death with the shotgun he borrowed from Kevin. He then called Michelle and the two met and had sex a few miles away. William, clearly feeling guilty about his actions, began researching time travel on the internet. While researching, he stumbled upon a spell that he believed might allow him to travel back in time. He even saved screenshots of the web pages. He was also communicating with people through the WhatsApp, asking them for help to travel back in time to correct a horrible mistake that was made. He also offered his soul to strangers in exchange for information on time travel. On April 19, 2017, William was arrested and charged with Anna's murder. They had found the murder weapon in his vehicle and retrieved cell phone data that put him at the crime scene. However, when he was brought in for questioning, he downplayed their relationship and said he barely knew her and they had only been on 2 dates. When asked about his KFC meal with Kevin, he said he threw the bag away outside a general store. When investigators pointed out that the bag was found at the crime scene, William quickly lawyered up. He and his attorney then began putting the blame on Michelle, and his defense team would continue with that allegation throughout the trial. On the surface, it seemed that Michelle was also a victim of William's lies and deceit, but she had allegedly made some very questionable comments. When she gave William the ultimatum, she told him to, and I quote, "fix this and get rid of her." She also said if Anna was, and I quote, "not gone by Thursday, I'm building a snowman." Michelle would later testify that building a snowman was a family joke about killing someone and hiding their body inside a snowman somewhere cold enough that it would never melt. While she insisted it was just a joke, William's attorney used that as part of their defense, claiming that it was a clear threat to kill Anna. Since the defense was trying to pin the murder on the prosecutors, showed a message that William sent Michelle that read, "We'll have this solved permanently." In November 2019, William was convicted of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. As for Michelle, no charges have ever been brought against her. After all was said and done, Anna's remains were cremated and shipped back to her family in Russia. In April of 2008, 18-year-old Quinna Fu was living in Bloomingdale, Florida with her mother, Vanna Nguyen. Quinna was a senior in high school working at the clothing store Abercrombie & Fitch. She was described as a very happy and energetic individual. Toward the end of April, she was making plans to graduate and getting ready for her senior prom. That is until a horrible tragedy changed her life forever. On April 24, 2008, after Quinna got off work, she went to the Bloomingdale Regional Public Library in Brandon, Florida to return some books. Since the library was already closed, she was just going to drop them off. However, when she pulled up, she noticed a man sitting on the bench nearby and found that rather strange. She was on the phone with her friend Rachel and told her about the man and asked if she would stay on the phone while she dropped off the books. Quinna got out of her car and opened the rear door where the books were. Then suddenly Rachel heard a terrifying scream and the call ended. When Rachel tried to call her back, there was no answer. She had a friend who lived nearby and she called and asked them to run over and check on her. She also called Quinna's mother Vanna and informed her of the situation. When the other friend arrived about 30 minutes later, they found Quinna's car still running with the door open. They noticed blood on the ground along with her cell phone, which was now broken into pieces. At that point, the police were called. When they arrived and began searching the area, they discovered Quinna's badly beaten body behind the library, but thankfully she was still alive. She was quickly airlifted to a nearby hospital in very critical condition. She then fell into a coma, but regained consciousness the following day. Surprisingly, she remembered what happened, and one of the first things she asked was, "Did they find him?" This moment of joy quickly faded, as the swelling in her brain worsened, causing her to have a seizure. Doctors quickly performed emergency brain surgery to reduce the swelling and then placed her into a medically induced coma. In the meanwhile, investigators discovered a utensil from the fast food restaurant Wendy's and took it for evidence. They also learned that not only had Quina been attacked, but she was also sexually assaulted. It wasn't long before the suspect was identified as 16-year-old Kendrick Morris, a sophomore in high school. As they dug into Morris's past, they learned he had been caught torturing animals, which is typically a psychopathic trait. 3 weeks after the attack, Quina came out of the coma. Unfortunately, she was now in a permanent vegetative state that left her blind and no longer able to walk or speak. However, she still has that beautiful smile she was always known for. She is now in the permanent care of her family and requires around-the-clock care. While her recovery has been difficult, she has been able to take a few steps with assistance and make a few sounds. She even got to have the experience of her prom that she sadly missed. Now back to the piece of shit who destroyed her life. It turns out he had also attacked and sexually assaulted a daycare worker. For both crimes, he was sentenced to 65 years in prison. A law was then enacted that allowed him to request a resentencing in 2017. In an amazing turn of events, he was given life in prison without the possibility of parole and, in my opinion, the sentence he should have originally received. Rachel Hannah Moran was born to parents Patty and Ronald on May 20, 1986 in Dover, New Hampshire. In 2023, 37-year-old Rachel was the mother of 5 children living in Baltimore, Maryland. She was also dating a man by the name of Richard Tobin. Family and friends described her as a very devoted mother who was the life of the party and had a great sense of humor. She loved fashion, fitness, and traveling to such places as Miami and Vegas. On Saturday, August 5, 2023, Rachel went for a walk on the Ma and Pa Trail in Harford County, Maryland. The trail follows the old Maryland and Pennsylvania Railroad and is typically known as a safe location with frequent visitors. After leaving her home that day, she was never seen alive again. Later that day, when she failed to return home, Richard went out looking for her and discovered her car in a parking lot at the entrance to the trail. At 11:20 p.m., he called police and reported her missing. The following day, a search party was formed and set out on the trail looking for her. At 1:07 p.m., a Native American tracker by the name of Michael Gazbrzuski and his stepdaughter, Cecilia, who was friends with Rachel and had joined in on the search, found her naked body in a culvert off the trail. She had sadly been sexually assaulted and beaten to death. The injuries to her head were so severe, she was almost unrecognizable. Richard was immediately looked at as a person of interest, not only because he was the one who found her car, but because he had been arrested 14 times since 2014 on charges including drug dealing, assault, disorderly conduct, and resisting arrest. People on social media also began pointing fingers at him. However, at the time of Rachel's murder, he had been clean for 15 months and was getting his life in order. He also took to social media to declare his innocence. Within a couple of weeks, the DNA from the crime scene ruled him out. The DNA was then uploaded to Cody's and matched to a wanted suspect in a case from California. Unfortunately, they didn't know the suspect in that case either, and the match was only between the DNA retrieved from both crime scenes. The case in California occurred in March 2023, when the suspect entered a home in Los Angeles and assaulted a 9-year-old girl and her mother. The man was captured on the front door security camera, but unfortunately, you couldn't see his face. The following month after Rachel's murder in September of 2023, investigators enlisted the help of Othram. After generating a DNA profile, their genealogy team got to work. In the meanwhile, investigators released a composite sketch of the suspect, hoping someone might recognize him. More than 1,000 tips across 7 states came in, but they were still unable to identify him. Finally, genealogists were able to provide investigators with some new investigative leads. And in early May 2024, the suspect was identified as 23-year-old Victor Antonio Martinez Hernandez. He had crossed into the country illegally in February 2023 after fleeing El Salvador, where he was also wanted for murder. Now that they had a name, they just needed to find him. On June 14, 2024, he was arrested and charged with first-degree murder after he was found sitting in a bar in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He is currently in jail in Tulsa awaiting extradition back to Maryland. Terrence Waynes Wicker, who went by Trey, was born on September 3, 1996 to parents Amanda McFarland and Terry's Wicker. In 2011, 14-year-old Trey was staying with his mother in Louisville, Kentucky. His mother, Amanda, was married to a convicted felon by the name of Joshua Gauker. Josh Young, his son from another woman, also lived with them. At the time, Trey was a freshman honor roll student at Seneca High School and appeared to have everything going for him until his life was tragically cut short. On May 11, 2011, students at Liberty High School were at the creek behind the school and shockingly found Trey's body. He had sadly been beaten to death. This location was within walking distance from his mother's home. Suspicions immediately began swirling around his new stepfamily. His stepbrother, Josh Young, was brought in for questioning but denied involvement, saying he and his father liked Trey and would have never done that. Young had even been a pallbearer at Trey's funeral. Strangely, though, he never showed any emotions about his stepbrother's murder. Young's own father, Gauker, told investigators he felt his son was responsible. Plus, Gauker was ruled out after providing an alibi. He was with Amanda and was seen on surveillance footage buying cigarettes from a gas station. Investigators eventually felt they had enough evidence and arrested 15-year-old Young in early 2012 and charged him with the murder. In a shocking twist, 39-year-old Gauker came forward and confessed to Trey's murder during his son's trial. He was then brought in to testify and said he took Trey behind Liberty High School to confront him for allegedly stealing a lighter and a plate of food. He then beat him to death with a pipe. He said the main reason for the murder was because Amanda was pregnant by him but had the child aborted. Because of Gauker's confession, a jury found Young not guilty, and the judge dismissed all charges. Trey's family was extremely upset and felt that he got away with murder. Meanwhile, Gauker entered a guilty plea and was sentenced to life in prison. Then in 2014, he tried to change his story and put the blame back on his son, saying he only pleaded guilty to spare him from prison. He then tried to have his conviction tossed out, but a judge rejected that. Interestingly, there is evidence that points to Young being the actual murderer. He was involved in a relationship with his cousin who lived next door to them. She said that around 1:30 a.m. on the night in question, Young showed up and said he murdered Trey. He then asked her to drive him somewhere to get rid of his blood-stained clothes and the baseball bat that he used. To this day, that bat has never been recovered. There's also the fact that Gauker provided incorrect details about the murder, such as using a pipe versus a bat. He also slipped up while on the stand and said when talking about the crime. In 2014, appeared on the Dr. Phil show along with Trey's father. During the show, he begged Young to tell them the truth, but he continued insisting he had nothing to do with the murder. Dr. Phil then called Gauker at the Kentucky State Penitentiary. During that call, Gauker once again put the blame on his son. Young's life would only go downhill from there from multiple arrests for assault, drug, and gun charges. Then in 2018, this case would take another shocking turn when Young wrote a confession letter while incarcerated at Grayson County Detention Center. In the letter, he took blame for the murder and said his father was innocent. He then told a new version of events. He said that on the night in question, he met Trey behind the school to smoke some marijuana. He claims Trey was being a smartass, which upset him, so he began hitting him with his baseball bat. He said he had the bat because he and Trey would often vandalize cars and people's windows. He said his hate for him began when they got pulled over one time and Trey told on him for having weed. He then confirmed his cousin was telling the truth about him going to her house that night to get rid of the bat and his clothes. Together, they went to an apartment complex and threw the items in a dumpster. He said that after the murder, He and his father took a vacation to Tennessee and then Alabama. While on that trip, he began confessing to that murder, but Gawker stopped him, saying he would need to pass a polygraph and didn't want to know the details. Could it be possible he's just saying all this because he is trying to get his father out of jail and doesn't believe he can be retried due to double jeopardy? After Trey's murder, Young got a teardrop tattoo and later admitted that it was for Trey. He has also never shown any remorse for the crime and was quoted as saying, like, "I don't even like the dude, I don't care. I mean, bad shit happened to better people. You know what I'm saying?" While this case is considered solved, many now wonder if the wrong person is behind bars. Do y'all think they both belong there because of how they destroyed Trey's family? Let me know what y'all think in the comments below. Ashley Ann Olsen was born in 1980 to parents Walter and Paula and grew up in Summer Haven. She was described as a beautiful, creative young woman with a happy, exuberant, generous soul. In 2014, after the divorce from her husband, 35-year-old Ashley moved to Florence, Italy to be near her father and to attend the Florence Art School, Bianca Capella. She ended up in a studio apartment in the Altrino neighborhood. She was very excited about her new life and began dating a Florentine artist by the name of Federico Fiorentini. On January 8, 2016, Ashley went to the Monte Carlo nightclub and after leaving was never seen alive again. The following day, Federico went to her apartment after being unable to get in touch with her. Since he didn't have a key to get in, he contacted the landlord who agreed to let him inside. That's when he tragically found Ashley strangled to death. When investigators arrived, they collected a cigarette butt and a used condom from her bathroom. Based on the DNA found under her fingernails, it appeared she had tried to fight off her attacker. Missing from her apartment was her cell phone and some of her personal belongings. Investigators then checked security footage from the nightclub and saw her leaving with a Senegalese national who was in the country illegally. The man with the last name of Diao was brought in for questioning and had his DNA tested against the DNA found under her fingernails, on the cigarette and from the condom, and it was a match. He was then subsequently arrested and charged with her murder. He said that the two of them were doing cocaine and drinking, and after arriving back at her apartment, they got into a physical altercation after engaging in consensual sex. However, he claimed that when he left, she was still alive. Her family didn't believe the sexual encounter was consensual because Ashley had received treatment days earlier for a severe bladder infection and was taking antibiotics. Plus, the autopsy showed that not only had she been strangled to death, but he had fractured her skull in 2 different places. Dal claimed that after sex, Ashley wanted him to leave and began pushing him to the door. He said when she turned her back to him, he punched her in the back of the head. At that point, he claims they got into a shoving match and that he picked her up by the neck and put her on the bed alive and moaning in pain. After that, he left her apartment. However, he never admitted to strangling her, but the autopsy showed she had been strangled with some type of rope or cord. Investigators were also surprised to find that he came back to her apartment for a second time. Regardless, Diao was convicted of murder and sentenced to 30 years in prison. Delamar Vera was born on December 5, 1997 at Temple University Hospital in Philadelphia to Lysita Quavis, who went by Luz and Pedro Vera. Immediately after Delamar was born, Luz met Pedro's cousin, Carolyn Correa, who had also allegedly just given birth a couple of days earlier while at home. Carolyn's teenage daughter, Angelica, was away from home that weekend visiting her father and had not been there for the birth. But a family friend had allegedly gone over to help. Angelica said she saw her mom 2 days after giving birth to a baby girl that she named Alia and Hernandez. On December 15, 1997, 10 days after the birth of Delamar, Luz went out searching for a job. While she was gone, Pedro's mother was babysitting Delamar and her 2 older brothers. Sometime after 5 p.m., Luz returned home to shockingly find smoke coming from the house. Everyone was outside and accounted for except for Delamar. Panicked, Luz ran inside, injuring herself through the smoke and debris, and came upon Delamar's crib, but it was empty. She also saw the window was open near the crib, which was strange considering the cold temperatures outside. Unable to speak fluent English, she began screaming that Delamar was missing. Pedro had arrived home after the firefighters and began crying out for his daughter. After firefighters got the fire under control, they told Luz that her newborn had perished in the fire despite never finding her remains. But Luz never believed this theory and felt her daughter was somehow still alive. The medical examiner's office even returned to the scene twice, once with a forensic anthropologist, but still no remains were found. A report would state that Delamar perished in an accidental fire caused by an overheated extension cord attached to a space heater near the crib. The case was then quickly closed, but Luz still remained adamant that her daughter had been kidnapped. For years after the fire, Pedro went to a baby shower and saw Carolyn and Alia leaving. Pedro said the girl looked at him, smiled and waved. He said that moment gave him a strange feeling inside. 2 years later, in January 2003, Luz attended a birthday party for a child related to Pedro. While there, Carolyn Correa showed up again with Alia, which caught Luz's attention and gave her a strange feeling in the pit of her stomach. The more she looked at Alia, the more she noticed that this little girl looked a lot like herself. She even saw a dimple that matched the dimple that Delamar had when she was born. She then began to think that maybe Carolyn had set the fire 6 years ago on purpose in order to steal baby Delamar. Then came up with a quick plan to try and prove this. She told Alia that she had chewing gum in her hair and would help her get it out. As Luz pretended to be getting the gum out of her hair, she plucked a few strands from the girl's head and took them to the police department. However, they said they were unable to perform those types of tests at the station. So finally, Luz contacted Angel Cruz, a Pennsylvania state representative who agreed to help. Cruz obtained hair samples from both Luz and the child and took them to the police for DNA analysis, along with Luz's accusation that Carolyn Correa had stole her baby and set the house on fire to cover the kidnapping. Shockingly, the test revealed that Alia was indeed Delamar. It turns out that Carolyn had strangely shown up at Luz's home around the time of the fire and claimed she had forgotten her purse in the upstairs bedroom. Right after she left is when the baby's room erupted into flames. There was even TV coverage from the night of the fire showing that Carolyn was at the scene standing near the ambulance with Pedro. It's believed that Carolyn kidnapped Delamar because her baby was stillborn, but there's also a theory that Carolyn may have never even been pregnant in the first place. When the DNA results came in, Carolyn was reportedly hysterical and didn't believe them. She claimed that if the girl wasn't hers, then who had her daughter? She even paid over $600 for her own DNA test before she was arrested. She clearly believed that Alia was truly her daughter. Regardless, Delamar Vera was returned to her family. Carolyn was arrested and found guilty of kidnapping, arson, and attempted murder. She was sentenced to 9 to 30 years behind bars. In court, Carolyn publicly accused Pedro of helping her steal his baby, which he denied. Some people believe that Carolyn suffered extreme postpartum mental illness after giving birth to a stillborn and convinced herself that Alia was her child. Others suspect that she could have suffered from the rare mental disorder pseudocyesis in which a woman, although not pregnant, believes she is pregnant and exhibits signs and symptoms of pregnancy. Andre Moore, who was dating Carolyn when she was allegedly pregnant, said she appeared pregnant and told him that Alia was his daughter. Andre was suspicious and took a paternity test in 1999, which proved he was not the child's father. Carolyn also had 3 other children who thought Alia was their sibling. She had obtained a birth certificate for Alia on January 6, 1998, reporting that she gave birth at home and listed herself as the attendant. The state registrar said Carolyn didn't need to present a baby, only an affidavit from the local registrar's office. That affidavit, however, was accidentally destroyed. The fire at Luz's home wasn't the only fire Carolyn had set. In 1996, she set fire to a Hamilton, New Jersey medical office where she worked. The fire was set in an attempt to destroy evidence after she stole and cashed company checks. For the crime, she was sentenced to 5 years probation. In 2001, Carolyn had a baby with her then-husband, Brian Busardo. Unfortunately, the baby had a heart defect and died a few hours after birth. Carolyn has also had at least 2 null miscarriages. The judge, however, wasn't buying the mental disorder suggestions and said that Carolyn may have suffered from depression but was more manipulative than delusional. While behind bars, Carolyn began having hallucinations of crying babies and repeatedly smashed her head into the prison cell walls and became suicidal, resulting in her being moved to the infirmary and put on a suicide watch. The forensic psychologist treating her stated that the hallucinations show that she likely believed the little girl was her natural daughter. De la Marvera is all grown up today and by all accounts seems to be fine. After getting their daughter back, Pedro and Luz signed a six-figure deal to sell their story for a movie which was created titled Little Girl Lost, the De la Marvera story. Jonathan Madden was born in 1991 in Toronto, Canada. He almost always smiled and loved Beethoven, watching basketball games and playing video games with his older brother, Kevin Madden. At the age of 12, Jonathan looked up to his 16-year-old brother, but there was a problem with that. You see, Kevin wasn't the best of role models and was actually a very troubled teen who often skipped school. When Kevin skipped school and got into trouble, it was usually with his best friend, Timothy Fairman, who often talked about drinking human blood, leading to the nickname Vampire Boy. On November 25, 2003, Kevin, Timothy, and another classmate once again skipped school. The three teens went to Kevin's home on Dolls Road, where they drank alcohol and trashed the house with baseball bats. At the time, Jonathan was at school, and their mother, Joanne, and their stepfather, Ralston, were at work. That afternoon, Kevin strangely told his friends that he planned to kill his entire family when they returned. Meanwhile, Timothy called his girlfriend to brag about what he and his friends intended to do. His girlfriend became worried and called back and recorded a conversation of the boys discussing their horrifying plan. Shortly after the call, Jonathan arrived home from school. When he entered the home, he was attacked by the boys and shoved down the stairs into the dark basement. That's where Kevin would savagely murder him with a knife. Following the murder, the boys hid Jonathan's body in a basement crawlspace and waited for Kevin's stepfather to come home. When he did, they attacked him with a baseball bat and knife, but he managed to escape and call the police. The three boys were soon arrested. Kevin's lawyer claimed that he was mentally ill and had suffered tremendously following the breakup of his parents' marriage. He resented his mother and stepfather and felt like Jonathan was receiving special treatment. Before the murder, Kevin had shown signs of mental trouble by assaulting his girlfriend and threatening to kill several of his classmates. Kevin put the blame on his mother, saying she never loved him. Several experts examined Kevin and all of them determined that he was deeply disturbed. But they all differed on what the actual cause was. The court-appointed psychiatrist Dr. Ian Swee said that Kevin was a psychopath with a personality disorder. He also said that Kevin was highly dangerous and very likely to be a repeat offender. Kevin's first trial would end in a mistrial after the key witness, Timothy's girlfriend, perjured herself. She made several posts on vampirefreaks.com indicating an interest in vampirism, contradicting earlier court testimony in which she minimized her interest in vampire fetishism. The reason that is important is because Timothy admitted that the plot to kill Kevin's family was his own fantasy, complete with vampire overtones concocted to impress his girlfriend who was also interested in vampires. However, it was ultimately determined that Timothy hadn't physically participated in the murder but had handed Kevin the knife. Furthermore, unlike Kevin, who told people not to be concerned with Jonathan's death, Timothy had actually shown remorse and shame for his participation in the murder. In the end, Kevin was found guilty of first-degree murder while Timothy was found guilty of manslaughter. The third teenager would end up being acquitted of all charges. During the sentencing phase, Kevin's defense lawyer fought for him to be sentenced as a juvenile and be sent to psychiatric treatment. But Kevin was instead sentenced as an adult and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 10 years. If he had been sentenced as a youth, he could have been released in as little as 4 years. Timothy was sentenced to 2 years in a youth facility and 3 years of probation. Melissa Suzanne Highsmith was born on November 6, 1969 to parents Alta Apentenko and Jeffrey Highsmith. Not long after she was born, the family moved from Fort Worth, Texas to southern Illinois. After moving, Alta and Jeffrey split up, and baby Melissa and her mother moved back to Fort Worth. She eventually settled in with her friend Carol in an apartment on East Seminary. In 1971, Alta placed an ad in the local Fort Worth Star-Telegram seeking a babysitter for Melissa, who was now 21 months old. Alta began working full-time cleaning churches and was desperate for childcare. Unfortunately, she was so desperate that she hired a woman who answered the ad without ever meeting her. She had attempted to meet the woman, but the woman calling herself Ruth Johnson never showed up. Ruth later called Alta and explained that she still wanted the job and there was nothing to worry about. She even told her that Melissa could play in her large backyard along with the other children she cared for. Alta agreed, and Ruth said she would be by the next day to pick her up. On August 23, 1971, the woman arrived to pick up Melissa, who was in the care of Alta's roommate, Carol, because Alta had left earlier in the morning for work. The woman entered the apartment, and after seeing Carol had a son, she offered to take him as well. Carol thankfully declined and sensed something was off about the woman who had just left with Melissa wearing white gloves, sunglasses, and a bonnet around her head in the middle of August in Texas. It was later speculated that the person could have actually been a man impersonating a woman. That afternoon, Alta returned home expecting Melissa to be dropped off at 5 or 6 p.m., but the woman never showed. She didn't have a phone number for the woman and had no idea how to track her down. Guilt and devastation overwhelmed Alta. Jeffrey also felt guilty knowing that she might not have done something so drastic if he had been helping her with child support. The FBI assisted the Fort Worth police, who initially suspected that Jeffrey could be responsible for the kidnapping, but he was ultimately cleared of any involvement. Law enforcement was also suspicious of Alta, but they were eventually able to mark her off the list as well. Meanwhile, Jeffrey and Alta would remarry and have 4 more children. For the next 50 years, they continued to search for Melissa. In the fall of 2022, 51 years after the kidnapping, a tip came in that a woman resembling the age progression photo of what Melissa could look like posted on the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children website was seen in Charleston, South Carolina. A news station in Charleston covered the case and other stations followed suit. Within weeks, the Highsmiths were in Charleston with an overwhelming hope that their daughter had been found. Sadly, the woman was not Melissa, but it did cause the case to go viral, which in turn caused nationwide interest. One day, the family decided to use the at-home DNA testing kits from Ancestry and 23andMe in an attempt to track down Melissa. Within 3 weeks, on November 22, 2022, the results came in. They were shocked and excited when they got a hit. Melissa had children whose DNA was matched with Melissa's parents. Days later, on Thanksgiving 2022, the Highsmiths were reunited with their long-lost daughter, Melissa, who was now 53 years old. It turns out Melissa grew up believing her name was Melanie, and her father was Japanese and lived in Japan. Shockingly, she grew up only 10 minutes from where she was kidnapped and had no idea she had been abducted. Melissa grew up in an abusive home and left when she was 15 years old. She later became a mother of 3 and grew up thinking the woman who raised her was her biological mother. Investigators are still working to determine who is actually responsible for kidnapping baby Melissa. However, they also noted that no arrest could be made in Melissa's case because the criminal statute of limitations expired 20 years after her 18th birthday. Risa Dawn Traxler was born on October 11, 1968 and lived with her sister and parents at the corner of Bringle Ferry Road and Shaver Street in Salisbury, North Carolina. On June 15, 1984, 15-year-old Risa was not far from home at her grandparents' house at 714 North Shaver Street. She'd been alone at the house for a few hours as her grandfather, Walt Monroe, went to the grocery store and his wife was at the hairdresser. When her grandfather arrived home, he shockingly discovered Risa's nude deceased body in the front bedroom. She had suffered multiple knife wounds that were described as overkill. There was no forced entry into the home and the family said nothing had been taken. Even though DNA testing was not a thing in 1984, it was still thankfully collected from the crime scene. Witnesses saw a man running in the area around the time of the deadly attack. Despite this, the small town began rumors that Risa's 13-year-old sister Jody Trexler, who was at the neighbor's house at the time of the attack, was responsible for her sister's murder. This rumor was even stranger considering that male DNA was found on Risa's body. Other rumors claim that Walt had killed his granddaughter. In 2018, Jody went on the Dr. Fields show and passed a polygraph test to prove her innocence. Her appearance on the show sparked renewed interest in the unsolved murder, prompting Salisbury Police Department to seek the services of Parabon Nanolabs. Using the DNA from the crime scene, Parabon created a DNA profile and submitted it to a public genetic genealogy database to begin the process of genetic genealogy research. After getting several matches, scientists constructed their family trees using online genealogy databases, newspaper archives, public family trees, obituaries, and other public records. This all led to one suspect, Curtis Edward Blair Sr. At the time of her murder, Blair was in his 40s and worked at the Frito-Lay factory just 2 blocks from the Trexler family home. He had also served time for an assault with a deadly weapon in 1986. Moved to San Diego, California 2 years after the murder, where he later died of natural causes in 2004. Authorities obtained a court order to exhume his body to gather DNA evidence for testing, which later confirmed that the DNA obtained from Blair's remains matched the DNA profile from the crime scene evidence. Thankfully, after 35 years, the Trexler family finally has some closure.